Hi, I'm Matt Runwick, and I am sharing this presentation, What School Leaders Need to Know About the Science of Reading. This is based on the free ebook resource that's available to download. Just a little bit about myself. Father of two teens, a husband to Jody, also a teacher. On the left side, you can see my son playing arcade games. Right now, he's in college, so when I come up to connect with him at his school, we always try to find something fun to do. My daughter is currently a junior in high school. I'm also a very part-time bookseller in an independent bookstore in my hometown. This is our dog Millie. She works on Sundays with me. She's very good at what she does. And finally, the one thing I enjoy doing is going to national parks. The most recent one was actually going to the Rocky Mountains for a mountain biking trip. This is actually from the coffee shop that I was sitting at. I actually drove the rest of the party up to the one of the trails and then came back down. I'm not a big fan of heights, so I'm happy to serve in that capacity. So I want to start with a book. I'm not going to read the book, but I want to reference it. The book is called Duck Rabbit. It's by Amy Krouse Rosenthal and Tom Lichtenheld. And if you've seen it, they use an optical illusion, a duck or a rabbit. One person sees it as a duck, another as a rabbit. This is a really good book to read for getting the emotional temperature to go down when we talk about this topic of the science of reading. So I've used this read aloud to then set up some questions. And if you're watching this with a group, I would encourage you to pause once you've read these 3 questions and just have a conversation with your group. The questions that you're invited to respond to: when we debate reading instruction, are we arguing about what's best for kids or about who's right? Where in your work do you notice people looking at the same data and seeing completely different things? And finally, what would it take for you to genuinely consider a perspective on reading instruction that you've resisted? So take a moment, pause the video if you'd like, and just talk or at least reflect on one or more of those questions. How this resource got started, the impetus for it was I was contacted by a colleague who was supporting a new administrator, and this new administrator was getting inundated already with requests for evidence-based workbooks, very phonics-heavy types of resources, and they're like, what is this science of reading? I don't really know much about it. So they asked me to reach out to this new administrator just to give my take on the science of reading. This is what I shared in an email. First, that reading instruction is complex. It's not a simple equation that you can just plug in resources and expect to achieve readers. Secondly, that the science requires inquiry, not dogma. So if any field is a true science, they're going to continue to conduct research and to look at what's working and what's not, and continue to reevaluate their current philosophies to be aligned with what we now know to be effective. So if it is a science of reading, then it should be based on inquiry. Thirdly, multiple sciences of reading matter. We can't just look at the cognitive science. We also have to look at the science of engagement, the science of motivation, the science of efficacy, as well as the science of goal setting with cognitive types of sciences. Also important is to have authentic text supporting the skill development. A lot of resources out there remove relevant, rich text from the skills, and we're just expecting kids to pick up these skills with some very isolated kind of skill practice, and we know that's not effective. And finally, programs do not equal responsive instruction. I've heard this referred to as solutionitis, where we just buy a program and we think reading scores are going to go up, and we know that's not to be the case. So I sent that email out, waited a few weeks, and didn't hear back. So I finally reached out to my colleague and said, hey, I haven't heard from this person. Is everything okay? And they ended up sharing that they were no longer in their position. They had left, and my initial assumption was, I had scared them off, or it just became too stressful. What I did learn was this person found kind of a dream job, and that's why they left. But it got me thinking about all of the other administrators coming into these roles, as new building principals, district level administrators, and not really having any kind of background on this whole topic, or even on literacy. So that's what I wanted to promote with this presentation, as well as the ebook. So the rest of this presentation is about my beliefs, what I believe right now, and it's not based on just my own experiences. It's also based on research. It's talking with other smart colleagues who know more than I do on these on topics in this area that I don't. So it's evolving. But my first belief is that teaching reading is not simple. We hear about like the simple view of reading. It's really not. It takes a long time to get very good at teaching readers. The second thing is that the science is anything but settled. I've heard this many times. The science is settled. This is effective. And the problem with that is it's going back to the inquiry versus dogma. If it's a science, it can never be settled, because we're constantly engaging in inquiry. Good intentions can lead to inequitable outcomes. This is my third belief, based on a lot of, purchases that have been made, thinking this is going to solve, any kind of equity issues. And it can actually create inequities. For example, when schools expect teachers to follow a program like a script, and if you're never responsive to kids' needs, you don't, veer a little bit away from the program, how are you going to differentiate for them? I don't see how that's possible. My fourth belief is that one science is dependent on another. That we can't just isolate skill practice from engagement, or from goal setting. They all work in tandem. They're mutually beneficial. When you can combine them, you're going to see much stronger results. And then finally, you can't buy the science of reading. The only real investment that works is investment in teachers, and investing in their professional growth and expertise. So in this session, the outcome is a conversation, not a conversion. That's what I hope to promote through this presentation and the resource. We're going to expand the notion of what counts in reading instruction, as well as provide strategies for engaging in professional conversations, provide entry points for empowering teachers and students as decision makers, build your professional knowledge, and explore our shared beliefs. I'm not gonna tell you which program to buy. I'm not gonna give you a script to follow. It would be the antithesis for what we're even trying to promote here. And there's gonna be no settling of the debate, other than that it's not simple. So the first belief is that teaching reading is not simple. On the left here is a picture of a recent article from the New York Times titled, "Kids Rarely Read Whole Books Anymore, Even in English Class." And I just found it funny because on the right side is a picture, not from my class when I taught 5th and 6th graders, 25 years ago, but that this is what my class would have looked like. We were all reading the same text. We were reading several novels every year, and then we moved away from it. We went to more of an anthology series, lots of excerpts, lots of questions, comprehension questions, skill packets, things like that. And I'm not saying like reading novels all the time is a best practice, but it's just interesting that we introduce these programs and then these are the results. Kids aren't reading books anymore. So how do we find that happy medium where we're being intentional? We have resources that do support our instruction, but they don't become the curriculum. How do we teach readers and not reading, as Peter Afflerbach likes to say? So this is the simple view of reading, as I mentioned before. This is from Go and Tunmer, and it reads like an equation. If you have decoding and language comprehension, you're going to be able to teach reading. And it's not that this isn't true. There is research that supports this. The problem with this is it's incomplete. This equation doesn't consider all the other ways in which kids become readers. How does this come to be? Emily Hanford's Sold a Story podcast series is one of the biggest promoters of this idea of a simple story of how we teach reading. So through the first 8 episodes, I did a count through the transcripts, and phonics is mentioned 48 times, comprehension 10, and engagement is mentioned 0. So you can see how the media is portraying reading instruction. And then this follows into legislation. A lot of state legislation, the Right to Read, as they call it in different states, acts. In Wisconsin, it's Act 20. Very phonics-based, phonics-focused, and doesn't really, even the assessments they use, like oral reading fluency, while it can be an indicator if a student's being proficient or not as a reader, they're not even measuring comprehension. So you can see how the media and pundits can influence the classroom. So what I promote is what Duke and Cartwright call an active view of reading. And it still looks at word recognition and language comprehension as effective, but it introduces some additional components. For example, if you look at the purple section in the middle, bridging processes, print concepts, reading fluency, vocabulary knowledge, these bridge word recognition and language comprehension in more authentic and realistic ways kids are actually going to encounter text when they're reading rich text. As well, if you look at the left side, you have the active self-regulation piece to it. So motivation and engagement, executive functioning skills, strategy use. These are all prerequisites if we expect kids to be highly effective and engaged readers. If you don't have motivation and engagement, executive functioning skills, it's going to be much harder to teach readers. And I also want to point out in the top left that this is a reader model, not a reading model. That's a big shift. And that they also note reading is also impacted by the text we choose, the tasks we develop and introduce, and socio-cultural context. So, for example, is there representation, diverse authors, diverse characters, written in a way that's that doesn't introduce bias, or stereotypes. Those are all important for teaching readers. So, a way to expand this simple view of reading is to expand our assessments. I have found as a principal and a teacher, what we measure is what matters. So, as leaders, we can introduce these things. There's nothing preventing us from introducing other measures to look at. So a lot of these right to read legislation legislative bills, expect, demand oral reading fluency to be measured, which is fine. But then can we also look at attendance? Can we look at behavior? We're looking at more root causes for why a student may or may not be successful as a reader. Look at past and current supports. For example, is the student you're looking at considered an English learner, a multilingual learner, emerging bilingual? What supports are they already receiving? Is a language barrier the reason they're not successful versus, skill in reading itself? And teacher observations. They see their kids for multiple hours every day. How are their voices being considered? And you might even include student voice in this if you want to do things like empathy interviews. So think about expanding what we mean by reading assessment. So the second belief is the science is anything but settled. I posted this on Twitter when it was still Twitter. I'm no longer on it. But I posted that I don't know who needs to hear this. Teaching a literacy curriculum program like a script, lesson by lesson, to all kids without considering their current interests, abilities, and needs is not scientific, drains the joy out of learning, and leads to inequities. It got quite a few views, was retweeted several times. A lot of the comments below it were positive, but of course there were a lot of pushback too. I recall one comment. This is a person, I think at the higher ed level, saying, "Oh no, teachers love to be trained on this. They love the script and to be able to teach their readers." So there's some really smart people out there who are again promoting this idea that the science is settled, and it's just not true. You'll even see it in the language of the science of reading when they use the word "the." It's very essentialist. It's very exclusive. It's kind of like the Olympic Games or the Ohio State University, right? If you're for the science of reading, then you believe this. But if you don't believe that, then you're not in the science of reading. And so there's been some hard feelings, where people will disagree within this science of reading movement, and then they end up kind of on the outskirts of these groups. So it just doesn't seem very scientific. And we mentioned before about any field, professional field, that considers itself a science, goes through these paradigm shifts. This was introduced by Thomas Kuhn, who is a historian and scientist, and he created a model where you have this normal science where the field agrees on certain practices, certain beliefs, certain ways of doing things in the profession. And then as the field learns more, the model, the standard of practice starts to shift until you get to a model crisis. Fields in science, if they're true science, eventually go through a revolution where they realize that the old ways of thinking are no longer relevant and are effective, and they adopt a new paradigm, new way of thinking. They have a paradigm change. So, Copernicus introduced the idea of the Earth revolving around the sun, not the other way around, and we just take that for granted now. I believe that we're stuck as a profession in terms of reading instruction and reading beliefs. Still in the model crisis, it's like a Ferris wheel that's just not turning around, and we're just not moving forward as a profession, and that's concerning. So how do we do that? We can't change the whole profession, right? But how can we do that at our local level? And one way I have found to be effective is to use professional journal articles to facilitate conversation, not to pound research and say this is the way it is and this is the way it's not, but to give space for educators in your organization to talk about these ideas. So you want to have an article that is balanced. This one from Rachel Gabriel, The Science of Reading Instruction, The Sciences of Reading Instruction, is very good. Has a nice metaphor, recognizes both perspectives, and it gives you some questions to think about. I would set this up with some norms, some shared agreements. These are ones that I use in my own work as a coach. Stay engaged, experience discomfort, speak your truth, expect and accept non-closure, to make sure that people feel brave in speaking up, and then even having some kind of protocols to have these conversations. For example, the 4A's protocol, or some other kind of a dialogue tool to make sure that the loudest voices aren't the ones that are monopolizing the airspace when we do set up times for conversations. The third belief is good intentions can lead to inequitable outcomes. This is in Wisconsin. This is our right to read law, and it's good to be familiar with it if in your state, if you do have one. Ours was written in July 2023. We're not sure who wrote it. We suspect that it's just been kind of adapted from other states, and like we said before, this language is heavily influenced by certain think tanks, organizations, even commercial providers, and as well as media people. It requires science-based early reading instruction. Mandates universal screening and intervention systems, which is already here in most states, if not all. There are some curriculum restrictions in a lot of these laws, especially no 3 cueing in core reading curriculum, starting in 24-25 in our state. Professional development is required around structured literacy, for example, letters or something equivalent for all K-3 teachers, principals, reading specialists. So there is some kind of a third grade promotion policy. In our state, we have to have a policy. In some states, kids get retained. For example, in Ohio, Florida, I believe, I know Mississippi has this too, where if a kid is not deemed proficient, they are retained up to a third of the entire group of third graders, and it's very worrisome about the long-term effects on that. Personal reading plans are required for all at-risk students with specific components and parent notification. There is usually in our state, there's an approved curricula list, so you can appeal to the state to say, we need to have this program approved by the state. We believe it's aligned with the law, and then you would hire someone to do some kind of an outside audit. So I think there's now like 9 programs in Wisconsin, so you do have some wiggle room, and they're very helpful when schools have reached out to the state department. So I share this idea of the good intentions can lead to inequitable outcomes because I do believe most people that were involved in this legislation do want kids to perform better. The problem is that you have single scores become almost students' identities, and this is an example. What's the difference between a kid who scored 24th on the 24th percentile and the 25th percentile in oral reading fluency? A couple of percentage points, or a couple of words correct per minute, maybe. Maybe this student had a rough night the night before, didn't get a lot of sleep, or didn't eat well, feeling sick, and now they have a personal reading plan. Now they have letters going home to parents. How are they interpreting that? We're not asking these questions. We're not asking kids like, do you still see yourself as a strong reader? We're not asking parents how they feel about this. So just a lot of more things getting done to us, and lacking agency and empowerment. So what I've seen in schools, the potential impact when this movement gets going in states, you have typically a more scripted curricula, limits on responsive instruction, as you saw before with our state law. We see lots of isolated skill practice, and you get then decontextualized text, and then assessments that measure what is easy to measure. And the effects of that is we remove things like voice and choice and what kids can read. Robust classroom libraries, even school libraries, start to collect dust in schools because they don't have any time to read them. The program is taking so much time, and that independent reading is not built into these programs, many of them. Teacher professionalism is taken away. They don't have as much decision making in how to teach their kids. Authentic tasks get removed, like project-based learning, which can be very effective for teaching readers in all subject areas. There's been studies that have examined some of these programs, and the texts are not culturally relevant. And then just time to read and talk with peers, things that kids just love to come to school for. So what can we do with this? One recommendation I make is to have kids, empower kids to take over your classroom library, or even your school library. This could be an ongoing project throughout the year. You can lay all the books out and say, hey kids, here are all the books. How do you want to organize them? What do we need to get rid of? What do we want to bring in? Give them some checklists to put on like a culturally relevant lens. Are we looking at diverse text, but as well as just books they want to read? And using like book orders and the book order points and have kids pick the books. You're going to need a lot more engagement with the reading, and kids are just going to want to read more, and they're going to be able to access the classroom library. Plus, it's one less thing that you have to do. You can expect the kids to do this work. The fourth belief is that one science is dependent on another. I was recently working with a team, and we were talking about teacher beliefs and like how important teacher beliefs are, for effective reading instruction. And we weren't really sure where it would belong. So I posed this question to them. Imagine that the principal in your school pulled all the core resources for ELA from every classroom. Would your teacher still be able to teach the students? So there was a pause, and finally we said, well, yeah, we could do that. We said, okay, what would it look like? And so then people started to write down what they would be doing. So I would invite you to pause the video here. This is a good chance to process, think about what's been said, but write down what you would do if you were in the classroom or are in the classroom and your core resource was gone. How would you teach readers and writers? So take a moment to reflect on that and hit pause if you'd like. And I bring this up because as I talk to other smart colleagues, one person pointed out that they don't really know what people who follow the science of reading movement, they don't really know what their theory is. They talk about sequential and direct, explicit instruction, but that's not a theory. That's just a process. But if you were to take away all these, again, scripts and resources, what do they actually believe? Like, what's their theory of action for teaching readers? And so that's why it's important as a school to have at least one instructional model that allows you to be responsive to kids. This is one that I've had in my past 2 schools as a principal. It's the Optimal Learning Model from Reed Routman's book, Literacy Essentials. What I like about it is that you can see the arrows going back and forth, and that we respond to what the kids need based on informal, real-time assessment. One day our kids may need some shared experiences where we're having some scaffolded conversations. We're charting what was demonstrated, explained. You might be doing, for example, shared writing, or shared reading. And then when you feel the kids are ready, like the majority of kids are ready, then we moved into guided reading. And you might realize, nope, we need to go back to shared reading. So this empowers the teacher. It takes a lot of professional development to as a school to grow in this capacity. But then we become kind of inoculated to the scripts, and the programs, at least following it like a script, and we can become more effective as teachers. More of a reader model is thinking in terms of the sciences of reading. We mentioned that before, but you can see how that this isn't just one way of thinking about reading. You have the cognitive science, comprehension, decoding, fluency, But you also have the affective sciences, motivation, engagement, identity, and they mesh together. And then when you add in cognitive sciences, the goal setting, self-efficacy, agency, for example, through the classroom library activities that can build on all three, that's when we see some real growth in kids. How do we build this knowledge with staff? As a principal, as a leader, I had to build my own knowledge. I had to create my own curriculum. So I would read professionally as a principal and then share that knowledge with my staff. There's several journals that I would recommend subscribing to. I subscribe to all of them. I don't read all the articles, but I certainly look through the table of contents and try to find maybe one that I want to pull out, read, and then summarize and share out now through my newsletter. This series through Reading Research Quarterly on the science of reading was a 2-part issue, and it was very good. So I would print off one article from it or make a copy of it, go to like the lunchroom, hang around, but also read and make notes in the margins, and then I would eventually summarize that into my staff newsletter as I sent it out on Fridays, and also link the original article. But then I'm being an information distiller for my staff, so they're familiar with the current knowledge base, and then we can have conversations. And I'm not coming across as an expert. I might come into a classroom with one teacher who's more camped in more of an extreme view of the science of reading, and just say, what did you think about that article, for example, on Orton Gillingham, that approach not being as effective as we thought? I'm not saying you need to change your practice necessarily, but I am having a conversation based on research, so it becomes a much more of a objective experience. So finally, you can't buy the science of reading. This became very clear to me as a principal in one of my schools. A reading interventionist was trying to get her student to come with her for intervention in first grade. This is reading recovery, which is a highly effective evidence-based intervention. But as good as it was, she couldn't get him to come because of a variety of reasons, which we were trying to understand. We suspected, executive functioning challenges, maybe a history of not being successful as a reader, and just not wanting to be removed from the classroom, not wanting to be singled out. And so she had this cool idea where she brought in a Venus flytrap into her office, and she said, to the student, if you come to my classroom, you get to feed the Venus flytrap one fly. So they did this for a while, to the point where I remember walking into her room one day, and there was a pile of flies, dead flies, next to the Venus flytrap. This student had started bringing his own food supply to serve to the Venus flytrap, and the teacher had to say, we can't feed it too much. It's going to get sick and die. They moved eventually away from the external rewards and reinforcements toward more internal and identity forming reinforcements. So this is an example. This wasn't the student, this is another student, but she would have the student, after meeting a certain benchmark, they met a certain benchmark assessment and wanted to celebrate. So she said, let's go down and pick out a couple books that you really want to read. And so that's how they celebrated. So, and this is where it gets complicated, and this is where I think that desire for a simple view is so attractive, because you can't buy this, you can't legislate this. This is developed over time, teachers' knowledge about not just reading but also about kids, pedagogy and literacy, thinking about not just the skills and strategies, but also the motivation and engagement, the self-efficacy, executive function and mindfulness. All of these different strands become like this reader braid that we're weaving together. And it takes time and a devotion to self-study and collective growth to make that happen. But this teacher had that. This teacher had those understandings of the different sciences and strands. She first identified where they needed more support, so they focused on skills and strategies, but that was the entry point. Because then when they noticed the resistance to intervention due to lack of self-efficacy, maybe didn't have a growth mindset, struggled with executive functioning, tapped into motivation and engagement through the Venus flytrap, and eventually to related texts that student wanted to read. And through that work, eventually the student became a more confident, competent reader over time, building skills and strategies because of weaving in these other elements of being a reader. And this shakes out with other schools that I've reached out to. As a principal, we did pretty well, but there were always schools that were doing better than us. So I'd like to look at like statewide scores and see what schools which were like us demographically. I would delete or remove schools that had large open enrollment or had small free and reduced. I wanted to look at Title I schools like us. And then I would cold call these leaders, principals, reading specialists, and I would ask them, like, what are you doing to get the results that you're getting? And I saw 4 themes across these conversations. First was high expectations for every student. Inclusion was the default. When they saw a need for intervention, they didn't just say, well, we're going to put this kid in this group and it's going to be pull out. They said, well, first, how can we meet the students' needs in the classroom? For example, like front loading or pre-teaching. So the classroom teacher working with the interventionist to, for example, if this was an English learner, giving them the vocabulary ahead of time and like pre-teaching the lesson before they went into Tier 1. So it might have been pull-out, but it was working in tandem between intervention and classroom. There was also a sustained investment in teachers. They were not cutting all their PD days, which I see in a lot of districts. They weren't just buying a program and saying good luck. They were actually investing in teachers through coaching, through sustained development. And the big one I noticed, though, was not one school used the same program. Every school is using something different. One school was invested in the units of study. Another one used more of an anthology series. One had developed their own program. What they did have in common, though, was a shared commitment to their beliefs and practices. And to the point where I recall one principal sharing that a teacher was not getting on board with their shared commitments, their shared values, shared beliefs. And they invited them very kindly and respectfully, but clearly to maybe look at another school to work at because, they weren't getting on board. So there were no superheroes in the schools. No one was like, stood out as just, any more knowledgeable than anyone else. But they had this willingness to have these conversations, to commit to what they knew to be effective, but also constantly evolving in their beliefs. And so that's one thing you can do, is to develop your shared beliefs as a staff. These are some of the beliefs that we developed in my last school. We used Reed G. Routman's book, Read, Write, Lead, and she has this list of over 20 beliefs, and every year we would put them in a Google form and say, do you agree or disagree with each one? And so the first year, I think we had like 2, and we celebrated that. We said, hey, this is where we agree on, we own it. And then the next year, we focused on the areas where we weren't in agreement in our professional development. And the next year we had 5, and then we continued to grow year after year. What was great as a principal is then I could go into classrooms during my instructional walks and talk to teachers. And if I didn't, first of all, I would affirm what they were already doing. Like, for example, if I saw kids rereading a lot, I would say, hey, I noticed your kids were rereading. How do you notice that's going for you? We know it's an excellent strategy, but what are you noticing? But I also had the authority to say when I didn't see things happening. For example, if the kids weren't doing a lot of independent reading or they weren't picking out their own books, I could ask questions like, what's happening there? Or if I saw like classroom libraries weren't being as a treated as a shared experience with kids. It was very teacher directed, teacher controlled. I could ask, like what's happening there, but we could have respectful conversations because the expectations were clear. This is another way you can do it. This is something I facilitated with staff, where you can post beliefs up on chart paper and then give teachers dots, and they can put on a spectrum whether they agree or disagree on it. So you can do this prior to the Google form where you ask them to agree or disagree, but then have people talk. Like, why did you kind of disagree with this, and get people talking with each other to really understand their perspectives. So this builds not only our shared beliefs, but it also builds this perspective taking skill, where no one's like, most people are not to the extreme on either end. Most people sit somewhere kind of in the middle, and we want to embrace that so that we can eventually move together toward agreement. So just to close, I recall a student who, through second grade, saw reading as something that you do in school, not really something you want to enjoy outside of school. A good reader, but by no means someone who was enjoying it. And in third grade, this student's teacher read aloud The Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing by Judy Blume. And this student could relate to the characters. He related to Peter Hatcher. He's an oldest of three boys. Could see Fudge and a younger sibling. A very funny story, but also had some real family topics in it. And this student reread this book till the pages were falling out of his own copy that he bought through a book order. To the point where he loved this book so much that he actually wrote some not so good fan fiction. You can see that on the left side, trying to emulate Judy Blume. And if you haven't noticed it, on the bottom left, you can see my name there on the fan fiction. Just to make the point here that that's how I became a reader. It wasn't through a script to follow. I mean, I'm sure I learned a few skills in kindergarten through second grade, but what unlocked reading for me and helped me see myself as a reader and to love reading was one read aloud by one teacher who knew her audience, knew her students, what was going to turn them on to reading, and as they say, the rest is history. So just to kind of close here, if you're going to remember one thing, to understand that one science is dependent on another, that we can't just teach these things in isolation. We can't just throw a bunch of great books at kids either in the classroom library and say, good luck, I hope you learn to read. Skills and strategies are very important. Teaching decoding fluency is an important skill. It's how we do it. It's not. It shouldn't be isolated from real text. Kids should be seeing themselves getting better as readers and loving reading, not just getting better at reading. So, a closing question is for you, and I would invite you to pause here. Is to answer the question, how do you choose to see your readers? So take a moment to think about how you're choosing to see your readers now, and maybe how you might want to see your readers a little bit differently tomorrow. Thank you for listening to the presentation, What School Leaders Need to Know About the Science of Reading. Please reach out if you have any questions. And again, thank you for your work. Thank you for your leadership and readership.